We are go for our question and answer session. Okay, everyone, I'm Dylan Jobe, president of Lightbox Interactive, and we just got done crunching our asses off on Starhawk. Hawkstar J was cool enough to pull together what he's calling the top 14 questions that must be answered. So I have put them together on cards. Here you can see there's a question that's right from Facebook, and I've made some notes, and I wanted to spend some time with you guys today just going over these things. And I think the first thing I want to mention is that I hope everyone knows that when you release a game, especially a big international multiplayer game like Starhawk, it's never like, and here's the disc, it's done, enjoy, and then we walk away. By no means. I mean, we have a contract in place with Sony for support and ongoing updates, so you're going to see the same rapid-fire updates, the same rapid-fire balance that you saw during the beta when we're actually fielding Starhawk live around the world. So we know that it's going to be an ongoing tuning and balancing adjustment as all the different players from all the different nations kind of come to grips with the cool gameplay of Starhawk. And so it's going to be a very kind of organic process as we continue to balance multiplayer. With that ramble out of the way, let me go ahead and jump into some of these questions. This question has to do with the melee combat. Fans thought that in the beta, what we called the drama kill, the melee was slow. You guys are right. One of the particular drama kills was really slow, and it left you guys way vulnerable when you would get one of those insta-kills and the drama cams. We have remedied that. We've got a new drama kill for like the front and back kills. It's real quick, grabs the outcast by the throat real quick and just goes right into the sternum and then throws him to the side. You actually see the ragdoll kind of tumble. It's really fast. Again, you're getting a one-hit kill, so there is going to be a little bit of penalty for the drama, and of course for the one-hit kill, but it's way faster than it was. And also you can wail away on R3 and get your swipes. You can actually do 2 swipes. That one is faster. Questions about air combat. This one was interesting because this got a lot of attention from our vocal pilot community, especially those players that came over from Warhawk. And this has to do with some players thinking that hawk-to-hawk combat felt a little bit weak because the weapons weren't doing as much damage to each other. And that was true and intentional, but we have made some changes in the final version of the game, and of course we'll continue to update it. But I wanted to give you a little bit of some backstory as to why we made some of those changes. We found that when you look at the game and all of the data, and we saw this in Warhawk and even, quite frankly, in some of the beta of Starhawk, we wanted to track life expectancy. How much time was a player able to stay in a particular mode? Were they able to stay alive in troop mode for 1 minute and 10 seconds in average in North America, or when you were in a Hawk, what was your lifespan when you're a mech? And we wanted to make sure that because we're trying to get as many players rolled into the Starhawk community, we wanted to make it a little bit more forgiving than Warhawk, because Warhawk, very dear to my heart, it was very brutal and very unforgiving. And the lifespan, the average lifespan in the air in Warhawk was way short. So what we did in the beta is we had all of the air weapons do markedly less damage than their counterparts did in Warhawk. Now, that said, while we were happy with the benefits that gave to the life expectancy, it kind of stretched out the dogfights a little bit more. It really was a bit too much, and Josh Sutphin, our lead game designer on Starhawk, has made a couple changes. Specifically, the one that really stood out was the homing missile. We always think of weapon damage to units in a scale of 100. So, you know, a troop is 100. It creates a good framework for debating weapons. So, for example, in the beta, I don't know the exact number, but I believe it was like 50 points of damage to 100 points of Hawk health. So you really needed 2 naked strikes with the homing missile to take a Hawk down. Of course, you can mix in machine gun play or swarm lasers, but we changed that. So now, instead of it being about 50 to the 100 health, it's a lot closer to 75 to the 100 health. And interesting to note for all the hardcore Warhawk fans that are watching this, you'll know that the 75 to 100 ratio is very, very close to what we had actually in Warhawk. Pilots especially are going to feel a lot better about that. We may have gone too far. Our life expectancies may get a little bit too short, and we may make some adjustments to the weapons. But that's one in particular that I think is going to really make you guys think that the air combat feels stronger. But like with everything, it's all just going to be about balance. Related to air combat, it's interesting, we wanted to have more powerful homing missiles, but I think a lot of you guys mentioned that the FLAK cannon was too powerful. And I think you could argue even in Warhawk, the lightning gun in the hands of someone who really knew how to use it was really powerful. But I can see where you guys came from, that the FLAK gun was a bit too powerful. We have made a couple changes there, but I think we're going to have to see how it plays out. I think this is something that I mentioned many times on our dev blog during the beta, that the danger is if you make a number of parameter changes all at once, which of course we have because we're going to be releasing on May 8th. It's very difficult to draw the correlation between cause and effect. While we want to embetter some of the air combat with the improvements to the homing missile, we want to make sure that we let those lie a little bit before we go through and make any other changes to some of the other weapons. So I think particularly to the FLAK cannon, it was a very powerful weapon. We really wanted to make sure that those pilots that were CQC, they were very close range pilots, had a great weapon. We may have gone a little bit too far with how powerful it was, but again, as you guys saw throughout the beta, the whole Starhawk architecture is based on a system we developed here at Lightbox Interactive called hotfixes. I mean, we could rapid fire content updates like that. And not just, weapon tuning stuff. That's simple stuff. We can move a base, we can, make alterations, we can change gameplay logic. I mean, we can do all kinds of things. So we are not shy about making those changes based on either feedback or the gameplay data that we see. While I continue to ramble, I should mention that there are times, and I know there are times where we will disagree on stuff across the community. And in fact, there are times where, I might think something, and I talk to Josh, who's our lead game designer, and I'll say, this feels weird, or, I just got ravaged in this game. So they can show me the very clear-cut objective data that helps separate emotion from the real balance. And I think that's something that we're always going to try to do with Starhawk. Everyone has a bad game or a great game, and if I get hate email or tweets or whatever about, oh, this is unbalanced and blah, 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 that might have been just a bad game. If we see a trend in the game data where we see something is clearly out of whack with the hundreds and thousands of players all over the planet, then we're going to start taking action. But we always take a very measured evaluation of it so that we take the passionate feedback that we get from our fan base and we do try to pair it with our data. This question here was, despite being in various locales, you guys felt like you wanted more variety in the maps. What you guys saw in the beta were 3 maps. You had Orbital, which is a big space station. You had a massive open desert scene with huge rock structures on the planet of Dust. And then on the acid sea planet of Scourge, you had one of our smaller maps there. That was 3 maps of 10 that are in Starhawk when it launches. They're all over the place. I mean, how there is one environment you guys haven't even seen yet on the planet of Sever, which plays a very prominent role in the single-player campaign. So, for example, you guys were familiar with Orbital, which is kind of the smaller space station map that you guys played in the beta. There is another space station called Apogee that's set in this nebula. It's kind of a colorful, foggy environment, and that space station has a lot of really interesting changes. It's actually got some bigger enclosed hallways and bigger chambers, like where the flag is, it's kind of enclosed and it provides players protections. Because I think, and actually one of the other questions in here had to do with, why can't bases have some pre-built structure? That was some feedback we got in the beta, and which was great because we could act on that in time for the retail release of the game. So you're going to see like the space map and Apogee, or for example, the maps on Echo, the Canyon planet, whether it's Lost Canyon or the Narrows. You've got these pre-built bases with these elevated platforms, one on each side. You've got these huge plateaus that aren't just like the big spires that you saw on Scourge, but they're actually big plateaus with kind of a flat surface on them that you can actually build. There's a lot of very different structures, kind of like we call it bone structure a lot of times when we're looking at our multiplayer maps. And so you've seen 3 of the 10 very different structures. And I'm imagining now, I keep forgetting that you guys haven't seen Sever. Sever is this planet that has been all broken apart. Early on we called it the Shattered Moon. And so you have all of these huge floating chunks of planet that are lifting away from the core, and they're connected by these suspension bridges. And the Outcast warbands that's kind of like their kind of home territory. So there's tons of Outcast totems and bridges and markings, and the gameplay on that environment is just amazing. They're big maps. You can fly underneath these huge chunks of planet, and there's like this rift there with these glowing colors, and you're actually underneath this huge chunk of planet that has been sheared off of the surface, and it feels like nothing else in Starhawk. And as far as different locales, you guys saw 3 of the 10, and they are all very, very different. So I can't wait for you guys to get a hold of the game and play those. So this is another question which I just kind of answered about the mix of pre-built structures, and we agreed. This was actually some feedback we got during the beta. And so we do have Apogee, which is the space map. Some of the maps I just mentioned, they do have pre-built structure to help support the defending team. So that'll add a lot of value to the maps. And again, it is a mix, right? We've got a mix of more open maps where you really have to rely on build and battle to build up your own kind of home base, but then we've got other maps that have a lot of additional supporting structure already crafted into the play space that allow you additional cover or air protection from hawks or what have you. The next question about the mini map. Can you make the mini map see the whole map? The way we kept it in the game was, and even in the retail product that you guys are going to pick up on May 8th, there's the small map that sees a small region in the lower left-hand corner. When you press select, it opens up. Still pretty large, and you see much more of the map, but you don't get to see the entire expanse, because we wanted to make sure that in the middle of the map, when it's expanded, right in the middle of the screen, whether you're flying or running around, that your player blip was right on your reticle, because you kind of want to be able to move your view around and have all that synced up. It was kind of cognitively weird to have your blip off somewhere else while you had the map up. Now, of course, you might ask, well, why not make the map not expand as much, but maybe just have it grow a little bit in the lower left-hand corner? And as anyone who's been playing in the beta and watching this video knows, that a lot of times, especially with build and battle, it's not just about your blip or the enemy blips. You kind of want to be able to discern the different parts in the map. Like, I want to know where a garage is, or a tank depot, or where a supply bunker is. And you need to have some minimum amount of zoom for that stuff to be really kind of readable. So all of that led into the zoom level that we have in the mini-map. That's not to say we won't make some change in the future to it, but that's how we have it right now. Okay, next question is about the flight ceiling. So the flight ceiling does vary from map to map. There is an upper bounds where it's kind of a gamey thing where your ship will kind of stall out or whatever. It's kind of like when you fly far out of the boundary and the game forces you into a turn and you have to come back in. And in some of the maps, players were saying that they felt like they were capped too much. It was artificially low. And I know the designers did go through and make some modifications here. We actually were pretty inconsistent in some places. And in fact, I remember a bug recently in a map that we didn't have out in the beta where the ceiling was just way too high. You get into some weird rendering anomalies when you end up flying way too high, but you also get into some very awkward gameplay situations because, as you all know, you've probably heard me mention many times, we're really trying to strike the right balance between ground players and pilots. And I know that's sometimes a hard thing to hear for all of the hardcore Warhawk pilots that were so great and just owned so many people in Warhawk. But the fact is that when you have the ceiling crazy high, you allow players to do this pure vertical dive bomb for such a long, maintained amount of time that it becomes incredibly frustrating for ground troops. And so there are all kinds of factors in play that affect air balance to ground balance, and ceiling is one of them. So we want to find the right balance. We've elevated them a bit, and we can open them up a bit more, but you got to be careful. If you have the ceiling way too high, you can just get all of this kind of column of death dive bombing. While it always sounds great to be the pilot who's pulling that off, all the combat balance has to be considered from both sides of the coin. So the next one, wanted to talk about vehicle speeds. Who doesn't want faster vehicles? When we first released the beta, the Hawk was actually much slower than it was at the very end of the beta. We made many speed improvements to the Hawk throughout the release, and we in fact ended up bringing the Hawk back to a speed where we were really happy with it, and that is measured in a couple different ways. It's, like I said before, it's in engagement time, it's traversal distance between bases, it's also the turning radius. One of the things that speed plays a direct role in is it's not just like one parameter gets modified and then, oh, everything's working. you can adjust speed, but then now the turning doesn't feel right. And you can adjust turning, and now you end up getting more fur balls, and the close combat doesn't feel right. So I can understand why people always want super fast vehicles and even more speed, but we actually are pretty happy with the speed of where we're at. And we actually saw that in the data at the end of the beta. But rest assured, we always want to try to get the most balanced game and the best game experience. So hopefully if you're angry with any change we made, at least you know we're well-intentioned there. So here's an interesting one, kind of unique to Starhawk. This has to do with the Rift energy economy. And one of the points here that you guys raised on Facebook was you think that the amount of Rift energy that is being paid out to just being in your home base is too high, and that it skews the balance such that it promotes you to just kind of turtle in your base as opposed to going out onto offense. While I can certainly see how that might be perceived, the data does seem to indicate otherwise. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some weird kind of aberrant behaviors that occur. So for example, the whole team turtles in the base and they build a bunch of turrets. All the people on the other team are just constantly running into your base, they're being cut down by the turrets, and then you're getting a lot of Rift energy. It's multifaceted. It's not just about the Rift energy that you get from staying in your home base. It's compounded by the fact that if you're playing defense, you get Rift energy for kills, but you also get Rift energy from the extractor itself, or the shrine if you're on the outcast side. So the Rift economy is something that all of the designers do watch like a hawk, pun not intended. Again, if we need to make some changes, we will. I mean, this isn't a done deal. But we actually feel that the amount that the players get in their base is actually pretty decent right now. If you look at the amount of Rift energy that a player can get when they go on offense, you can get way more. The challenge is, if you're not that good of a player and you go on offense, you might get a dry spell. You may not get as much Rift energy. You may have to rely more on the Rift caches that are scattered around the environment. So you kind of have to adapt your strategy, because you have a lot of players out there that may want to enjoy shooters but don't have the crazy dexterity to be able to compete with the Twitch players that are out playing offense. It's kind of like different roles in football or some other sport. But like with everything, I mean, there's a lot of new stuff in Starhawk, and so we may have to do some tuning. I would be willing to bet that within the first couple weeks of release, we're going to get some really good data as to whether or not this particular item needs to be acted on, and if it does, we will not hesitate to push a hotfix out. And believe me, our hotfixes can go out in a day. We don't have to wait for a big corporate patch or anything. We've got a great relationship with Sony. They totally trust us. If we want to make a change, we do it and push it out. It shows up everywhere on the planet, and we continue to tune. Question here was, torpedoes are penetrating the shield generators with too much ease. Are you planning to address this? Yes and no. I mean, again, it sounds like a broken record now. We are always looking to address whatever. We can update everything in the game, and we know that the best way to balance the game is to be able to be involved and very active in the community. One of the issues we had in the beta when we first rolled out the torpedo was really a couple things. It had an enormous blast radius. It actually did way too much damage for surface area, so that got adjusted. The other thing is that the pickup was respawning in very quickly, and the torpedo weapon is supposed to be this kind of like Omega Hand of God kind of weapon. So it's not supposed to happen as frequently as you guys saw in the beta, and we probably should have rolled out a hotfix in the beta to pull down the respawn rate of the torpedo, or maybe put the torpedo pickup in a more dangerous location. So respawn rate on the torpedo takes longer for that weapon to respawn back in. But here's one of the other things in the beta, and this was a bug which we didn't have time to fix in the beta. The torpedo couldn't be shot down. And so a weapon of this power needed to have a good balance. The torpedo, when it's flying at you, it has this huge sound, and you hear it, and it's got the big blue glow and everything, and you're like, oh my god, a torpedo. It's coming at you. You can shoot it out of the sky. It doesn't have a lot of hit points. It's the only projectile weapon that can be shot down. So if you've got someone in your base protecting it, you can shoot that torpedo down before it strikes your base. So there's a kind of a cool gameplay there. But again, in the beta, you couldn't shoot it down. It was just a stupid bug. Unfortunately, that has been resolved. So the hope is still that with all of those changes in place, we think that's going to work out. I mean, of course, we'll see how the data plays out when we release. But as with anything, if it doesn't look like that's working, we'll see it in the data, and we'll go ahead and make a change. So this is one And you know what? My heart's right there with you too. You know, I think when we first launched Starhawk, we were a little bit nervous about how Build and Battle was going to be received by the player community, because it's certainly the way we executed it is very, very new. Players wanted to be able to build more structures. You know, we have right now, there's a per team, whether it be Rift or Outcast, you have kind of like your population cap, like you might see in an RTS. And you get up to 32 structures at any one time. Then there's 32 structures for the other team, and then there's 64 structures. And everyone is often, you know, saying, oh, I want more, you know, double it or triple it, kind of like I want bigger guns and faster vehicles and all of that stuff. And in this case, I actually would probably love to have a few more buildings, but there's a couple other things that play into this that I think a lot of players don't realize, that every time one team gets their structure limit increased, of course you've got to do that on the other side. And then, again, we support split screen. So you've got the 2 viewports, which is then going to double the object count and the polygon count again. So, you know, when you're talking about playing in a big player game, let's say you're playing in a game with, you know, 24 players, you've got 24 players, you're running split screen, all the buildings are there, you just have an enormous amount of assets that have to be rendered and moved around and maintain good frame rate for that split screen viewport too. That's one of the conditions we have to take into consideration. One of the other things we have to consider is just the amount of memory. If you think about a strategy game, you know, you've got a big distant camera perspective, buildings or structures that have kind of their outside shell. That's very different than a structure that you might see in Starhawk that is highly detailed with, you know, lots of beveled cement elements and pipes and displays and, you know, animated doors. You can go inside and, you know, there's all this detail. They just take up an enormous amount of memory. And so we're always trying to juggle the memory footprint of all of those parts. I would also say that with regard to the 32 structures limit, we still feel that still can feel right, even with what we've got playing here after the beta, because it's not so much, oh, I want to have more structures. What feels weird is when the teams are always hitting that cap. And we have data in there. We can see at what point in the game does a team hit the 32 part cap, how long do they stay at the cap, you know, when it drops, how long do they drop, how long does it take them to rebuild. In this case in particular, we feel, based on what we've got here in the studio, that with proper balance of weapon damage and health of structure, that the proper entropy of the structures keep the team always floating, you know, not constantly pegged at the cap, but right at the sweet spot. So it doesn't feel like a barrier that's like
a crimp in your style.
A crimp in your style.
A crimp in your style.
It just feels like the safeguard that we have to have in place from a memory perspective. And I think this is, of all the questions that came in, this is one of those ones that, you know, I would really love to be able to give you guys even more structures, but I think we're going to be able to get a really great solution with the structure limit with some of the other Rift economy and combat balance in the game. One of the things on here was preventing base camping. We earlier talked about, you know, bases with pre-built structure so that you couldn't get all your structures destroyed. You had some places to go hide, and whether it's on Epigee or any of the, you know, the maps on Echo, there's some really cool structures there. But one of the other things that I want to mention, and there wasn't actually specifically a question on this, was something that we ended up changing for zones mode. We didn't make one modification to it, however, and this was to help protect getting ravaged at your base over and over again. In Warhawk, if you remember, you had all the bases that you could go capture, and then your zones would grow and you get link bonuses and all that stuff. It was one of my favorite modes. But if you were getting rolled, which sometimes you did if you didn't have a good strategy, your team sucked or whatever, you'd lose all your territory and you were back at your home base. You could never lose your home base. So you're pretty much condemned to just sit in your home base and pretty much take it over and over again. And that was something that really got changed. So we have this concept of this world victory now. So there are no pre-locked home bases and zones. You both have a starting base, but again, with Build and Battle, you can be exploring out and conquering new areas and building extractors or shrines if you're on the Outcast team, building up a new base, and the base that you started with at the beginning of the game might get overrun by the enemy. If you're playing a game and you just get brutally worked over by the enemy team, they can destroy all your territories well, your team wasn't very good. They get the world victory, you at least get the mercy kill. You don't have to wait for the next 10 minutes and just get rolled over and over again in your base. And while that seems like a weird thing to protect against base camping, that is an important thing from an experiential perspective. And so I think that change to zones was really important. I'm glad Josh kept fighting for that. Let's see, turret spam. This was something we saw a lot of at the end of the beta when we got a lot of new players into the game. Auto turrets are small turrets. They're most successful against ground troops, and we saw lots of players just spend almost their entire team's structure limit on auto turrets. We love the auto turrets. They're very effective. They play a great role in the game, but there were a couple changes that the designers made to the economy that I think make a huge difference on the turrets. First of which, they're not as cheap as they once were. We change the prices all the time. I think right now they're 3 cells of Rift Energy. But more importantly, they are far easier to take out with weapons now. So some of you guys that are watching this video and played at the end of the 1.3 beta know what it was like to try to get into a base that had 20 auto turrets all over the place. Now, they're able to be brought down way easier. They're still effective, they're still good items, they still fill the role in the build and battle roster, but attacking players can cut them down way more easily. So they cost a little bit more and they're a little bit easier to take out, and the team feels pretty good about those changes. Okay, here's another one. I'm sure this is going to be a sensitive one. I'm sure there'll be comments about this. Why no vehicle health bar? In fact, we don't actually have a health bar in the game at all, whether you're in a troop or whether you're in a vehicle. And this was intentional. We knew we were going to have build and battle HUD. We knew we were going to be throwing some other HUD elements at the game. We were nervous about having even more HUD, and we wanted to try making the player understand where their health was without having kind of the old school gamey bar or the ring, or games displayed a bunch of different ways. I know there was some ambiguity among some players, but once you kind of get the feel of the sounds and the look of all the visuals, I mean, they're very clear steps. I think you've got sparks at the 50% level and fire at the 75%. You kind of use that to gauge for your health bar. And we feel good about that. That's one less kind of gamey thing stuck on the screen. We do think that once you've played it a bit, you do kind of get into the zone and you pick up on those state changes. And we think it's still a very successful way of understanding what the health of the vehicle is. And the same with the troop too. You've got your directional take hit indicators, and then when you're real low health, you've got the overlay and all of that. So we feel pretty good about where we're at there. But I'm sure if you guys still continue to don't, you'll tell us. Lastly, this was one of the things that we added in the 1.3 beta. And it was loadouts. This is something we're really happy with in the game. Build and Battle gives Starhawk players a ton of flexibility because you can build your layout how you want. You can make your base over here or there. You can play with these vehicles or that vehicle. And when we rolled out loadouts in the 1.3 beta, we had this concept of strategic and blitz loadouts. That was done very intentionally. We knew that there were some players that just wanted to get immediately into the game. They wanted a ton of Rift Energy to start with. They wanted a base that was pre-built. They just wanted to jump in, wham bam, thank you ma'am, and get combat going. But then there was another group of players that liked a little bit more of the progression through the units. And so both of those loadout types speak to slightly different game experiences. And I think that's what's cool about Starhawk, is that it's kind of this super mega shooter toy box. You can do so many different things with it and play it in so many different ways. And so one of the comments here is we really need more loadout options. And so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the additional loadout options. We still have the difference between the blitz loadouts and the strategic loadouts, so that you've got pre-built bases, more starting Rift Energy. But we actually have 10 loadout structures in the game, some of which, like Lone Wolf, that has vehicles that are primarily just for a single player. So the Hawk, a jetpack, the jet bike. Then you've got other sets which are like air superiority, the Hawk and jetpack. So let's say you're a player and you don't want all the crazy brutal pilots in your game rolling you all the time. You can run with a ground pounder loadout and not have Hawks in your game at all. You can just all be ground vehicles, no jetpacks or anything like that. And so there's a bunch of different versions of the different types, plus strategic and blitz. It gives players a bunch of options. So when you create your server, you can set up your rotation in a bunch of different ways. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we've got our deathmatch dogfight mode. So for those players who just want to get their raw space combat on, have crazy dogfights, you can set those up. We didn't have that enabled for you guys in the beta. You can set up a rotation and just do deathmatch dogfights over and over again. You know, you just want to do 8-player free-for-all dogfights for 2 hours. You can totally configure the servers to do that, and that's awesome. I love dogfighting. As always, you know, I've said this probably on every card now, with everything that I've talked about, whether it's these 14 questions or the 1,400 questions that you guys are going to raise after we launch, we're always going to be listening, and we make quick updates based on the stuff that you give feedback on. We don't always agree with the feedback, but when we do, we look at the data and we make quick change. So we ran the beta for a long time, but on May 8th, it's going to feel like a completely new and fresh game. So I think that's it for the 14 items. I can't wait to answer even more questions in the days and weeks to come.
Visit UrgentFury.com and get your clan registered today.
PlayStation